That was the moment I realized I had been invisible for years, and somehow I had let it happen. I was sitting at my own kitchen table, the one I bought 32 years ago at an estate sale in Dayton, the one with the small burn mark on the corner from a candle I lit the Christmas my husband Walter came home from the hospital. My daughter was across from me, and her husband was leaning against the counter with his arms folded, and neither of them was looking at me. They were looking at each other the way people do when they've already decided something and are just waiting for the other person to catch up. My daughter said, "Mom, we've been talking, and honestly, the vacation fund doesn't make sense right now." I asked her what she meant. She said, "The money you've been saving. The trip to Portugal. It just seems irresponsible, given everything. I'd been saving for that trip for 2.5 years. $40 here, $60 there, sometimes $100 when my Social Security check came in and the electric bill was lower than expected. I had a folder on my computer, my granddaughter Lily had helped me make it, with pictures of Lisbon, the yellow trams, the tiles on the buildings, a little restaurant near the waterfront where a food writer I liked had eaten bacalhau and said it changed his life. I had printed those pictures out and put them in a folder in my nightstand drawer. I looked at them sometimes before I went to sleep. Given everything, I repeated. My son-in-law pushed off the counter and sat down at the table across from me. He had a way of taking up space that I had never quite gotten used to, even after 8 years of him being in my family. He wasn't a bad man, I want to be honest about that. He wasn't cruel by nature, but he had a way of presenting his preferences as facts, and my daughter had learned to do the same. He said, "Sandra and I are looking at a down payment situation. The rates aren't going to stay where they are. If we're going to move before the school year," I said, "you want my vacation money for your down payment." My daughter reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "Not want. We just thought, since you're not working anymore and the trip is kind of a luxury." I looked at her hand on mine. I thought about all the hands I had held. Her small ones when she was 4 and we crossed parking lots. Her teenage ones when her first boyfriend broke up with her and she cried in my car for 40 minutes outside a Wendy's on Route 40. Walter's hands in the hospital the last week when squeezing back was all he could do. I said, "Let me think about it." She smiled. He nodded. They thought that meant yes. I need to go back a little because this didn't start with the kitchen table. It started, or I started to see it clearly, about a year and a half before that conversation, when Sandra and her husband moved in with me. It was supposed to be temporary. They were between leases, and the apartment they wanted in Glendale wasn't ready until March. And it was November, and Sandra called and said, "Mom, would it be weird?" And I said no, because she was my daughter. And it wasn't weird, it was just life. People help each other. I had the spare room. I had the basement that Walter had finished the year before he got sick. I had space and I had quiet, and I had, if I'm being honest, too much of both. They brought 63 boxes. I counted because I had to move things around to fit them, and I needed to know how much of my own space I was reorganizing. 63 boxes, 2 large pieces of furniture, a dog named Brisket who was not the issue but also was not small, and a general understanding, unspoken, assumed that for the duration of their stay, the house would run on their schedule. March came and went. The apartment in Glendale fell through. There was something about the landlord, a dispute about the deposit on the previous tenant's units, something I didn't fully understand because Sandra explained it quickly and moved on to asking whether we had more olive oil. By summer they had a new plan. They were looking to buy. The market was difficult. Everyone said the market was difficult. I said I understood and that they were welcome to stay while they saved. I believed myself when I said it. By the following spring, I was eating dinner at 7:15 because that was when they were usually home, not because it was when I was hungry. I had moved my desk from the office into my bedroom because her husband used the office to take work calls. I was watching television in my room most nights because the living room had become their living room in a way I hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite articulate. Brisket slept on the couch I had reupholstered in 2019. None of this was dramatic. That's what I keep coming back to. None of it happened in a way I could have pointed to and said, this. This is the moment. It was an accumulation, like sediment. Sandra was attentive in the way she had always been attentive. She asked about my doctor's appointments. She remembered to buy the creamer I liked. On Mother's Day, she took me to a brunch place in Pasadena with good eggs Benedict, and she cried a little when she gave me the card, which made me cry, which made us both laugh, and I drove home thinking things were fine. But things had a way of being fine and also being something else underneath, and I had gotten very good at noticing only the fine. My sister called me from Phoenix in February. Her name is Carol, and she has never had much patience for things she considers avoidable, which she communicates through questions. She said, "Are they still there?" I said, "They're saving for the down payment." She said, "Evelyn, that's what you said in October." I told her the market was difficult. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you still have your desk in your bedroom?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Get your desk back." I didn't. I thought about it for the next 3 weeks, which was its own kind of motion. The money conversation happened on a Thursday. I had come home from my water aerobics class. I go on Tuesdays and Thursdays at the YMCA on Vermont. It's the one real hour of the week that belongs entirely to me. And Sandra and her husband were both home early, which was unusual. They had made coffee. There were 3 mugs on the counter, which meant they had been expecting me. After Sandra said what she said about Portugal and her husband said what he said about the rates in the school year, I said I would think about it. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed. I have a photograph on my nightstand of Walter and me at our 25th anniversary dinner. We're at a restaurant in Cincinnati that doesn't exist anymore, and I'm wearing a green dress, and he's wearing the tie I gave him for Christmas 3 years earlier, the blue one with the small white pattern. We look like people who believe the future is a place they're going to enjoy. I sat there and I thought. Walter worked for 31 years at a job he found tolerable, but not much more than that. I worked for 24 years as an office administrator for a pediatric practice, which I loved more than I ever said out loud. We saved carefully. We didn't take many vacations. We meant to. We had a list. Portugal was on it, had been on it since we saw a documentary about Lisbon one Sunday afternoon, and Walter had said, "We should go there when we retire." And I had said, "We will." And that was as close as we ever got to a plan. He retired and then he got sick, and we didn't go. I sat on my bed for a long time. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my laptop and I looked up the Portugal trip. The folder Lily had helped me make. The pictures of the yellow trams. The restaurant near the waterfront. Then I looked up flights. I looked up hotels. I looked up travel insurance because I'm 67 and I believe in travel insurance. And then, without letting myself think about it too long, the way I might have let myself think about it too long 20 years ago, I booked it. 2 weeks in Lisbon and the Alentejo region, leaving the 15th of next month. A small hotel near the Alfama neighborhood. A cooking class. A day trip to Sintra. I used the vacation money. I used it all, and then a little more. I closed the laptop. I felt something I didn't have an immediate word for. Not happiness exactly. Not triumph. Something steadier than both. Something that felt like remembering a language I used to speak. I didn't tell Sandra that night. I made myself dinner. Pasta with butter and garlic, which is the dinner I make when I want to think. And I ate it at the kitchen table with a book. And when Sandra and her husband came through to get water and ask what I'd decided, I said I was still thinking. This was not entirely dishonest. I was thinking. I was thinking about a lot of things. I was thinking about a conversation I'd had with my friend Pauline, who has known me since we were both young mothers in the same neighborhood in Cincinnati. Pauline lost her husband 4 years before I lost Walter, and she has a directness that comes from having survived several things that would have softened a less honest person. Pauline had said to me months earlier, "You know what your problem is. You confuse being needed with being loved. They're not the same thing." I had disagreed with her at the time. I had said that in families the two things overlap considerably. She had said, "Sure, they overlap, they're not the same." I ate my pasta, and I thought about that. I also thought about something my financial advisor had told me the previous year. A woman named Pat, who I'd started seeing after Walter died, because Walter had handled our finances, and I'd understood them but hadn't managed them. And after he was gone, I needed to learn the difference. Pat had told me that my retirement accounts were in good shape, that my social security income covered my basic expenses with room, and that the money I was spending on groceries, on utilities, on incidentals that had grown since 2 additional adults and a dog had moved in was more than it should be relative to what I was receiving from the household in return. She hadn't said this critically. She had said it the way she said most things, which was plainly, as a fact, the way a doctor tells you your blood pressure is elevated. I had nodded and moved on to questions about my investment allocation, but I had thought about what she said. The next morning, I called my sister Carol. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was either in her garden or waiting for me to call. And Carol's garden in February is mostly dormant, so I told her I had booked the trip, she said. Portugal? I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, good. Just that. Good. Not finally or it's about time or I told you so, even though she had told me, obliquely and consistently, for the better part of a year. Just good. I loved her for it. I told her I hadn't told Sandra yet. She said, when are you going to? I said I wasn't sure. I said I was still thinking about how. She said, Evelyn, you don't need a strategy. She's your daughter, not a negotiation. I said, I know. She said, do you? I told Sandra on a Saturday morning. She was making eggs. Her husband was in the backyard with brisket. The kitchen smelled like coffee and toast, and there was a normalcy to the moment that I was grateful for, because I didn't want this to be a dramatic conversation. I have never wanted drama. I have, on occasion, settled for erasure to avoid it, which I understand is its own kind of problem. I sat down at the table with my coffee and I said, I want to tell you something. She glanced at me from the stove. Okay, I said. I thought about what you asked, about the Portugal money, and I've decided to use it for the trip. She turned around. She had her mother's face when she was surprised. Walter's mother, I mean his family, had the same wide-open expression when something caught them off guard. And for a moment, she just looked at me. She said, you already booked it. It wasn't a question. She knew me. I said, I leave the 15th. She put down the spatula. She said, Mom. I said, that money was Walter's and mine. We saved it together, even though he didn't know that's what it was for. I think he would have liked Portugal. The food, definitely. The history. He liked history. Sandra's eyes went pink at the edges. I hadn't expected that. She said, I wasn't trying to take something from you. I said, I know. She said, we're stressed, and I thought. I said, I know what you thought. I understand the stress. I know the market is hard, and I know you want to be settled before the school year. I want that for you too. I paused. And I'm going to Portugal. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said quietly, Dad would have loved it. I said, he would have complained about the flights and then spent the entire first day in a seafood restaurant and talked about it for the rest of his life. She laughed. It came out wet, a little broken, the laugh of someone who is also on the edge of crying, and I understood it because I was in the same place. I said, I love you, and I'm going. She nodded. She picked up the spatula. She didn't say anything else right away, and I didn't need her to. Her husband was harder. Not that evening. That evening he was quiet in a careful way, the way people are quiet when they're recalibrating. But 2 days later he brought it up, in the kitchen, with the folded arms posture I had come to recognize as the precursor to a position. He said he thought it was worth revisiting. He said they were in a time-sensitive window. He said that the money would be repaid. He used that word, repaid, as though I had offered a loan and then withdrawn it, and that my trip could be delayed a few months without any real consequence. I let him finish. Then I said, the tickets are non-refundable. This was not entirely true. I had bought travel insurance, but it felt like the right sentence. He looked at me. I looked at him. I thought about the desk in my bedroom. I thought about dinner at 7:15. I thought about Walter's tie in the photograph. The blue one with the small white pattern, and the restaurant in Cincinnati that doesn't exist anymore. I said, I think it would be good for all of us if you two started looking at your own timeline more seriously. I'll help where I can, but I'm not the solution to the problem. He didn't say anything. I said, I'm going to go read. I went to my room. I got my book. I did not feel like reading, but I sat in the chair by the window and I held the book, and after a while the holding was enough. They found an apartment 3 weeks later, not the house they wanted, an apartment in Burbank, a two-bedroom on the second floor of a building with a small courtyard which Brisket would appreciate. The rent was manageable, the commute was acceptable. Sandra called me when they signed the lease, and her voice had the sound of a decision made, the particular flatness of someone who has stopped fighting something and found it wasn't as bad as the fighting. She said, "We're going to be okay." I said, "I know you are." She said, "You'll come for dinner once we're settled." I said I would. She said, "And you'll call from Portugal?" I said, "I'll send pictures." She said Dad would have. She stopped. I said, "Darn punches." She said, "Dad would have." She stopped. I said, "I know." I left on a Tuesday. My neighbor from down the street, a woman named Joyce, who has been a quiet and consistent presence in my life for 11 years, drove me to LAX at 5 in the morning. She didn't say much, which was what I needed. She pulled up to the departures curb and she put the car in park and she said, "Have a wonderful time, Evelyn." I got out. I stood on the sidewalk with my suitcase and I looked at the entrance to the terminal and I thought of Walter saying we should go there when we retire. And I thought of myself saying we will, and I thought of all the years between that sentence and this sidewalk. Then I went inside. The flight was long and I slept poorly, and the coffee they served was not good, and I didn't care about any of it. I landed in Lisbon in the early morning, and the light coming through the terminal windows was a color I didn't have a name for, golden and thin and very old, and I stood there for a moment before I found the baggage claim, just standing in it. I went to the little hotel near the Alfama. I dropped my suitcase. I didn't sleep. I walked down to the waterfront. I found a cafe and I ordered coffee and something with custard, a pastel de nata, which was the thing the food writer had mentioned, and I ate it, standing at the counter, the way the locals did. And it was sweet and warm, and the pastry shattered when I bit into it, and I thought, Walter would have had 3 of these. I thought about him without sadness, which surprised me, not without grief. The grief is always there. It becomes part of the furniture eventually. You learn to walk around it without knocking your shins quite so often, but without the heavy kind of sadness that used to arrive with the thought of him and stay for hours. This was lighter. This was more like company. I walked for 2 hours along the waterfront. The trams were exactly what I'd hoped. The tiles on the buildings were blue and white and old, some of them cracked, and I liked the cracked ones best. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check my find for the first half of the day, which is something I have not done since before Walter died, since before the years of being the person everyone called when something needed managing. I sat at a table outside at noon and ordered lunch in very poor Portuguese that made the waiter smile, not unkindly, and I ate grilled fish and bread and drank a small glass of local wine and watched the river. I wrote in my notebook, "I am here." 3 words. I closed the notebook. I stayed for 2 weeks. I went to Sintra, which was everything the pictures had promised, and also more complicated and more beautiful than the pictures could hold. I took the cooking class, which was 4 other people, and an instructor named Anna, who had strong opinions about olive oil and was right about all of them. I drove through the Alentejo on a day when the light went flat and silver, and the cork oak trees looked like they were painted onto the landscape, and I pulled over and got out of the car and stood there for 10 minutes and didn't think about anything in particular. On my last night, I went back to the waterfront. I ordered a glass of wine and a small plate of cheese, and I sat there until it was dark, and the lights came on over the water, and I thought about the list Walter and I had made, all those years ago, of the places we meant to go. I thought I could go to them. Not all at once, not recklessly, but one by one, the way you read a list of things you've promised yourself, crossing them off not with regret, but with a kind of quiet recognition. I didn't call anyone that night either. I took a photograph of the water with the lights reflecting on it, just for myself, not for sending, not for showing. I put it in the same folder as the pictures of the yellow trams. When I got home, my house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for a long time, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment, adjusting to the quiet, and then I made tea, and I brought it to my desk, which I had moved back to the office before I left, just moved it back. No announcement, no explanation. Just put it back where it belonged. And I sat down and I wrote Carol a long email about the pastries and the tiles and the woman named Anna who had strong opinions about olive oil, and the afternoon in the Alentejo when I stood next to the car and didn't think about anything in particular. I didn't send it right away. I read it back to myself first. It sounded like someone who had remembered how to take up space. It sounded like me. I pressed send. I keep thinking about the moment I closed the laptop after booking that flight, not the argument that came after, not the conversation with Sandra at the stove, not even the morning I landed in Lisbon and stood in the light coming through the terminal windows. Just that one quiet moment, the click of the lid coming down, and the feeling that followed it. I've spent a lot of years being careful. Careful with money, careful with feelings, careful not to take up more space than seemed reasonable for a woman my age. Living alone no longer needed in the daily urgent ways that used to define my days. And I think I confused that carefulness with virtue. I thought being small was the same as being good. It isn't. I understand that now in a way I couldn't have explained to you before Portugal. What Sandra asked of me wasn't wicked. She wasn't trying to harm me. But when I sat on the edge of my bed that Thursday afternoon and actually looked at what had been happening, the desk moved to the bedroom, the dinners at their schedule, the quiet accumulation of my own erasure, I had to be honest with myself about my part in it. I had let it happen, not because I was weak, but because I had mistaken accommodation for love and silence for peace. That distinction cost me 1.5 years of my own home. The honest thing, the genuinely moral thing, wasn't to keep absorbing. It was to say clearly, this is mine and I am keeping it. That takes something most people don't talk about enough. Not anger, not confrontation. It takes the kind of clear-eyed understanding that looks at a situation without flinching and calls it by its right name. I had to understand what was actually happening before I could do anything about it. Pauline had tried to tell me. Pat had shown me the numbers. My sister Carol had asked about my desk. The information was always there. The hard part was letting myself see it. And then there is the matter of doing the thing anyway once you've seen it. Booking a flight when someone you love is disappointed. Moving your desk back without making a speech about it. Standing at the arrivals curb at LAX at 5 in the morning with a suitcase. Deciding that the list you and your husband made 20 years ago still counts for something, that the person who said, "We will go there," is still worth keeping a promise to. That's not stubbornness. It's something quieter and harder than stubbornness. It's deciding at 67 that you are still a person with a life that belongs to you, not to your grief, not to your children's timelines, not to the version of yourself that learned to be small and called it humility. Walter would have complained about the long flight. He would have had 3 pastries at that cafe on the waterfront and talked about them for the rest of the trip. I ate mine standing at the counter, and I thought of him without the heavy kind of sadness, which surprised me. I think that was the real rival, not the plane touching down. That moment at the counter with the pastry shattering in my hands, understanding that carrying someone you've lost doesn't have to mean staying in place. I pressed send on the email to Carol, and it sounded like me. That was enough.